Barbara Hutton was called the poor little rich girl because history needed a simple way to blame her for being unhappy. The world saw jewels, palaces, titles, and 7 marriages, then decided her sadness was proof that she had wasted a life of privilege. But her fortune was never the shield people imagined. It made her visible. It made her desirable. It made her loneliness useful to husbands, newspapers, and high society. Every time she reached for love, safety, or belonging, someone else found a way to turn her wealth into access. Barbara Hutton was not ruined because she had too much. She was ruined because too many people understood exactly how to use what she had. In 1930, America was deep inside the Depression, and Barbara Hutton was introduced to society as if money itself needed a stage. She was 18 years old. Her debutante ball was reported to have cost around $60,000, an extraordinary amount at a time when ordinary families were standing in bread lines, losing jobs, and reading headlines about collapse. The contrast was too sharp for the public to ignore. One young woman entered a ballroom surrounded by flowers, jewels, formal gowns, and flashbulbs, while much of the country was trying to survive the next week. That night did not only introduce Barbara to high society, it gave the press a symbol it could sell. She became the rich girl America could envy, pity, mock, and resent all at once. Newspapers did not have to understand her. They only had to describe the money around her. The price of the party, the weight of the jewels, the famous family name, the Woolworth fortune, the clothes, the guests, the scale of it all. The girl herself nearly disappeared beneath the inventory. That was the first public trap. Barbara was not treated as a young woman entering adulthood. She was treated as proof of excess. To readers struggling through the Depression, her life looked obscene. To society, families with titles, debts, and estates to maintain, her inheritance looked useful. She stood between 2 kinds of hunger. The public wanted to look at her fortune and feel outrage. The elite wanted to get close enough to use it. Her wealth protected her from poverty, but it did not protect her from being watched. In fact, it did the opposite. It made every gesture public. Every dress became a statement. Every party became evidence. Every friendship could be read as a transaction. The world saw a girl with access to almost everything and assumed access meant safety. It did not. Access can open doors, but it can also invite the wrong people inside. The press helped build the myth quickly. Barbara Hutton was presented as the girl who had it all: money, beauty, jewels, travel, mansions, and a name tied to one of the most familiar retail fortunes in America. The story was simple enough for any reader to understand. If she was sad, she must be spoiled. If she was lonely, she must be ungrateful. If she made mistakes, they could be blamed on having too much. That label would follow her for the rest of her life. Poor little rich girl. On the surface, it sounded almost sympathetic. Underneath, it carried a judgment. It made her pain sound childish. It turned a complicated woman into a cautionary phrase. It allowed the public to feel both superior and entertained. They could envy her money and still believe she deserved her unhappiness. The cruel part was that Barbara's fortune did not create the kind of power people imagined. It created exposure. She could buy rooms, houses, jewels, travel, and attention. But attention is not care. A paid companion is not a safe person. A title is not protection. A husband can stand beside a fortune and still never see the woman holding it. From the beginning, her human value was hard to separate from her financial value. Before she spoke, people already knew what she was worth. Before she entered a room, people knew what she could fund. That knowledge changed the way people approached her. Some came with flattery. Some came with pity. Some came with romance. Some came with legal documents. The language changed, but the direction was often the same, toward the money. This is why the story cannot be told as a simple warning about excess. Barbara Hutton did not merely spend too much or love unwisely. She grew up inside a world where money shaped every relationship before trust had a chance to form. Her wealth made her desirable to people who did not have to love her, honestly. It made her sadness easy to dismiss. It made her mistakes easy to laugh at. It made her vulnerable in a way the public refused to recognize. People saw the heiress and missed the child inside the myth. They saw the ballroom, the jewels, and the expensive name. They did not see the early wound that had already shaped her, long before the world began calling her spoiled. The loneliness people later mocked did not begin with husbands, yachts, or ruined parties. It began much earlier, inside a family that had money for everything except emotional safety. That early wound came before the world had any reason to envy her. In 1917, when Barbara was only 4, her mother, Edna Woolworth Hutton, died inside the family's suite at the Plaza Hotel. Later accounts have repeated the story that Barbara discovered her mother herself. The official cause was reported as suffocation linked to mastoiditis, while rumors of suicide followed the death for decades. The exact private truth remains difficult to settle fully. What matters for Barbara's life is the result. A child lost her mother before she could understand the adult silence around it. That kind of loss is not repaired by an inheritance. It is only covered. The Woolworth name could protect a fortune, a reputation, and a public image. It could not explain to a small girl why the central figure in her world had suddenly vanished. Barbara was left inside a family structure that had money, staff, and rules, but very little room for open grief. The adults around her had the resources to manage appearances. They did not have the language to help a child feel safe. The family story became controlled because families with fortunes often control stories before they heal wounds. The death was not allowed to become an open emotional center of Barbara's life. It was handled, contained, and folded back into the larger image of the dynasty. To the outside world, the Woolworth name still meant retail success, wealth, and American achievement. Inside Barbara, something much less visible had been broken. The public would later see her as the richest girl in the world. It would not see the child who learned early that money could not keep the people she needed from disappearing. After her mother's death, Barbara did not find the kind of steady home that could have helped anchor her. She was raised among relatives, governesses, tutors, schools, and paid caretakers. Nothing about her childhood looked poor from the outside. The rooms were expensive, the clothes were proper, the staff knew what to do, meals were served, lessons were arranged, travel was organized. But maintenance is not the same as love. That difference mattered. A child can be perfectly cared for and still feel emotionally abandoned. Barbara learned that attention often came through duty, payment, social obligation, or family management. People were around her, but that did not mean they belonged to her. The adults who controlled her world could arrange her schedule, protect her name, and prepare her for society. They could not replace the mother she had lost, or give her the kind of secure attachment that makes a person harder to exploit later. The fortune made the problem harder to name. If Barbara felt lonely, people could point to the house. If she felt unsafe, they could point to the staff. If she felt unloved, they could point to the money. Her privilege became a wall between her pain and everyone else's sympathy. That wall would follow her into adulthood. It would become one of the reasons the public found it so easy to dismiss her suffering. To them, a rich girl did not have the right to be wounded. This is where the poor little rich girl myth began to take shape, long before the nickname became famous. It was not only a media invention, it was a way of refusing complexity. Barbara had everything visible and lacked something basic. That contradiction made people uncomfortable. Instead of asking how a child could be materially protected and emotionally exposed at the same time, society chose the easier answer. She must be spoiled. That misunderstanding left her exposed. As she grew older, Barbara carried a hunger for belonging that money could not satisfy. She wanted loyalty, tenderness, and the feeling of being chosen for herself. But the world around her had already learned to see her as an heiress before seeing her as a person. That meant every offer of closeness arrived with a question attached. Did they want Barbara, or did they want what Barbara could provide? She was not equipped to answer that question safely. Childhood had not given her strong defenses. Wealth had not taught her ordinary trust. The people around her often had motives hidden behind manners. In that world, affection could look polished, formal, and convincing while still being calculated. A smile at dinner could become a proposal. A proposal could become a financial negotiation. A marriage could become an extraction. This was the trap waiting for her. The fortune that should have made her secure became the thing that placed her at the center of a social market. European titles, old houses, family debts, and fading aristocratic names all moved toward American money. Barbara's loneliness made her vulnerable to that market. Her inheritance made her valuable inside it. By the time she began marrying, the pattern was already set. The world would call it romance, scandal, bad judgment, or excess. But beneath the headlines was something colder. A young woman trained to confuse attention with safety was entering a marriage market that knew exactly how to turn wealth into access. The marriage market around Barbara Hutton did not look crude from the outside. It looked polished. It came with titles, formal dinners, old names, careful introductions, and men who knew how to sound protective. But behind the manners was a clear exchange. Europe had aristocratic families with prestige and debt. America had heiresses with money and a hunger for belonging. Barbara stood exactly where those two needs met. Her first marriage, to Prince Alexis Mdivani in 1933, gave the public the kind of story it already wanted from her. The Woolworth heiress had married into a title. Newspapers could write about romance, glamour, and old-world elegance. Readers could imagine that money had finally bought her entry into a higher kind of life. But a title does not make a man safe. It only gives the transaction a more beautiful cover. The pattern became clearer with her second marriage to Count Kurt Haugwitz Reventlow. He came with aristocratic rank, but the marriage soon became one of the darkest chapters of her life. Later accounts describe the relationship as controlling, frightening, and heavily tied to money. Barbara was not simply a wife inside that arrangement. She was a fortune under pressure. The private question was no longer whether she would be loved. It was who would control access to her wealth. In 1937, under the influence of that marriage, Barbara renounced her American citizenship. The decision was widely understood as connected to tax and financial strategy. On paper, it may have looked like an administrative move. In human terms, it showed how far her life could be pushed by the people around her. Even citizenship, one of the most basic markers of identity, could be pulled into the machinery of wealth management and marital control. The public rarely understood the fear inside that kind of marriage. From a distance, Barbara still looked protected by houses, servants, accounts, lawyers, and a famous name. But money can create a strange kind of captivity. It gives a woman rooms to hide in, but it also gives other people reasons to keep her inside them. When the person closest to her wanted access, the fortune became less like safety and more like leverage. Later reports and biographical accounts describe the marriage as emotionally harsh and deeply damaging. The exact details are not always easy to separate from gossip, but the larger pattern is clear. Barbara entered marriage looking for safety and found another system of control. Her childhood wound made abandonment terrifying. Her money made her useful. A determined man did not have to break down her defenses all at once. He only had to understand where she was already weak. This is what the public missed when it laughed at her marriages. It saw a rich woman making bad choices. It did not see how many people were waiting to profit from those choices. It did not see the polished pressure of aristocratic families, tax lawyers, social expectations, and husbands who knew the value of standing beside her name. The same newspapers that mocked her instability rarely asked why so many men with titles kept moving toward her fortune. The birth of her son, Lance Reventlow, in 1936, gave Barbara something more real than society had ever offered her. He was not a title. He was not a headline. He was not a legal strategy. He was her child, and for a woman who had lost her mother so young, that bond carried enormous emotional weight. But even motherhood did not remove her from the pressure surrounding her marriage. Custody, money, reputation, and control soon became part of the same fight. When the marriage to Reventlow broke apart, Barbara did not simply walk away from a private failure. She entered another public story. The press had fresh material: the heiress, the count, the child, the lawyers, the money, the accusations, the collapse. Her pain became readable because it came with names and figures attached. The more serious the wound became, the more profitable the coverage grew. Her eventual escape from that marriage required legal force, money, and public exposure. That fact matters. Barbara Hutton was one of the richest women in the world, yet even she had to fight to get out of a life that had become unsafe and humiliating. Wealth gave her options, but it did not spare her from being used. It only made the battle more expensive. After Reventlow, the public label hardened. Poor little rich girl no longer described only the heiress with too much money. It became a way to explain away every wound that followed her. If a marriage failed, she was foolish. If a man used her, she had chosen badly. If she looked broken, she was spoiled. The system around her stayed clean because the blame kept returning to the woman. That was the cruelty of the myth. It made Barbara responsible for every person who saw her fortune before they saw her face. It turned extraction into romance, coercion into bad judgment, and loneliness into entertainment. By the time one titled husband had left and another story was already forming, the public had learned the easiest way to read her life, not as a woman being used, but as a rich girl who could not stop ruining herself. The press understood the value of that version immediately. Poor little rich girl sounded soft enough to pass as sympathy, but it carried a sharp judgment underneath. It told the public that Barbara's sadness was almost childish. It made her pain sound ridiculous because it existed beside jewels, houses, servants, and money. The phrase allowed readers to pity her for a moment, then laugh at her in the next breath. That was why the label lasted. It was easy to repeat. It turned a complicated life into a headline. Barbara did not have to be understood as a woman shaped by early loss, public exposure, and predatory marriages. She could simply be reduced to the heiress who had everything and still could not be happy. Once that version settled around her, every later mistake seemed to confirm it. The public did not need to know the details of the legal fights, the emotional pressure, or the way men moved toward her money. It only needed the nickname. Poor little rich girl explained everything without explaining anything. If another marriage failed, the label was ready. If she looked lonely, the label was ready. If she spent too much, trusted the wrong person, or appeared fragile in public, the label made it all feel like her own fault. Then came Cary Grant. Her third marriage, in 1942, brought a very different figure into her life. Grant was not a titled European aristocrat trying to repair an old family estate. He was a Hollywood star with his own money, his own fame, and his own hard history. He had known poverty in England before he became one of the most polished men on the screen. That background mattered. He understood money, but he did not worship Barbara's fortune in the same way others had. Their marriage became the one exception people still remember. Grant has often been described as the husband who did not take her money. That fact gave the relationship a different emotional weight. For Barbara, who had been approached so often through the value of what she owned, a man who did not need her fortune was not a small thing. It may have felt like proof that affection could exist without a bill attached. But even that did not make the marriage simple. Grant could refuse her money, but he could not undo the childhood that had taught her to buy closeness. Barbara had spent too long inside relationships where gifts, payments, jewels, travel, and emotional access were tangled together. When money has been the language of attention for most of your life, it is hard to suddenly believe love can arrive without a price. The contrast between them became difficult to bridge. Grant had built himself through discipline, work, and restraint. Barbara had grown up inside a world where money was both protection and poison. What looked generous to her could look wasteful to him. What looked careful to him could feel cold to her. They were not only two people in a troubled marriage. They were two survivors of very different worlds, trying to speak across a distance neither of them had created alone. That is what made the collapse painful in a different way. The marriage did not fail because Grant came to strip her fortune. It failed because Barbara's wound was deeper than one good man could repair. The absence at the center of her life had become part of how she reached for people. She wanted closeness, but often reached through the only tools her world had taught her to use: gifts, status, need, and urgency. When the marriage ended in 1945, Grant was widely remembered as walking away without the financial extraction that had marked other men in her life. That detail should not be turned into a fairy tale. He was not a cure. He was not proof that love had finally saved her. He was proof of something sadder. Even when the financial trap was removed, Barbara still did not know how to feel safe inside love. The public did not handle that truth with care. A failed marriage to a movie star was too useful. It kept the story moving. The poor little rich girl had lost another husband. The heiress had failed again. The fact that this marriage was different, that it exposed the emotional damage beneath the financial damage, was harder to fit into a society column. For Barbara, the end of that marriage narrowed the world further. If aristocratic husbands had used her fortune, and the one husband remembered for not using it still could not stay, what did that leave her with? The question was not simple self-pity. It was the question at the center of her life. Could anyone love Barbara without first being overwhelmed by what Barbara owned? There was one person left who could answer that question differently. Her son, Lance Reventlow, was not a husband, not a social climber, not a title, not a headline romance. He was the only child she had. For all the distance and damage inside their family, he remained the one bond that money had not created. And that made what happened to him later the wound her fortune could not cover. Lance Reventlow was born into the same problem that had shaped his mother. He inherited wealth before he had any choice in what that wealth would mean. He was Barbara's only child, the son she wanted to love and protect. But her own life had never given her a stable model of protection. She could give him money, homes, travel, education, and access. What she struggled to give him was consistency. His childhood carried the effects of her marriage to Count Haugwitz Reventlow and the separation that followed. Custody disputes, distance, and the movement between households made his early years uneven. From the outside, Lance had every material advantage. From the inside, he grew up with the same kind of fracture that had marked Barbara's childhood. Money everywhere. Emotional steadiness harder to find. This is one of the quietest and saddest patterns in Barbara's life. She did not want to repeat the abandonment she had suffered. Yet pain that is never healed often gets passed forward in altered form. Her son was not neglected because she lacked feeling for him. The record suggests she loved him deeply. But love alone cannot create a secure home when the mother herself has spent her life moving between fear, dependence, marriages, scandal, and public judgment. As Lance grew older, he looked for a world where the Woolworth name could not decide everything. He found that world in racing. Motorsport offered something society never could, a result that depended on timing, nerve, engineering, and skill. On a track, a family fortune could buy access, but it could not drive the car for him. It could not take the turn. It could not make the machine respond at speed. That mattered to Lance. He wanted an identity that was not only inherited. His Scarab project became part of American racing history, remembered for producing some of America's first Formula One cars. It was ambitious, expensive, and difficult. It did not turn him into the dominant figure he might have wanted to become, but it gave him something real, a field where he could build, test, fail, and be judged by more than his mother's money. For Barbara, his independence was painful and necessary at the same time. A child who grows beyond you can feel like a loss, especially when you have already lost so much. But Lance's efforts also gave her a kind of pride that society could not manufacture. He was not just another person circling the fortune. He was trying to make something with his own name attached to it. Their relationship was not simple. It could not be. Too much history stood between them. Barbara had given him the inheritance of wealth, but also the inheritance of instability. Lance had reasons to seek distance. She had reasons to cling. That tension does not make the bond false. It makes it human. The tragedy is that they never had enough ordinary time to repair what money, custody fights, and public life had damaged. Then came 1972. Lance Raventlow died in a small plane crash near Aspen, Colorado, along with 3 others. He was 36 years old. For Barbara, this was not just another loss added to a long list. It was the loss of her only child, the last relationship that still connected her to a future beyond the old headlines. The fact of the crash was brutally simple. No fortune could change it. No lawyer could negotiate with it. No title, yacht, jewel, or estate could soften the finality of the news. Barbara had spent much of her life watching money open doors, buy silence, attract husbands, and control appearances. In that moment, money became useless in the most complete way. It could not bring back her son. After Lance's death, something in Barbara's life narrowed permanently. The world had already mocked her marriages, judged her spending, and turned her sadness into a nickname. But this wound was different. It was not a scandal. It was not a failed romance. It was not an extravagance the public could laugh away. It was a mother losing the one person who could never be reduced to a financial transaction. That did not mean the public suddenly understood her. Public sympathy for rich women is often shallow and short-lived. People may recognize grief for a moment, then return quickly to the old story. Poor little rich girl, 7 marriages, too much money, too many mistakes. Lance's death could have forced a more honest reading of Barbara Hutton. It could have made people ask what remained of a woman after the last real anchor was gone. Instead, the old myth survived. In the years that followed, Barbara withdrew further. Her health declined, her circle became smaller. The fortune that had once seemed endless was no longer the stable force the public imagined. Decades of spending, settlements, management, taxes, gifts, and disputed financial decisions had weakened it. The empire that once made her a target was now thinning around her. This is where the story becomes even colder. Barbara Hutton had been valuable to the world when her wealth looked limitless. Men wanted access to it. Newspapers wanted headlines from it. Society wanted spectacle from it. But as her health faded and the fortune weakened, the public fantasy began to lose its shine. The woman who had been watched all her life was moving toward the one place wealth had never protected her from: isolation. After Lance was gone, Barbara Hutton's life became smaller. The woman who had once crossed oceans for marriages, parties, titles, and society rituals began living more privately, often in hotel rooms, and protected spaces that looked luxurious from the outside, but felt increasingly closed. The Beverly Wilshire became one of the final settings of her life. To the public, a suite in a famous hotel still sounded like privilege. To Barbara, it was closer to a retreat from a world that had taken almost everything it could use. Her health was no longer strong. Accounts of her later years describe illness, frailty, and growing dependence on the people around her. That dependence mattered because Barbara's life had always carried one dangerous pattern. The closer she came to weakness, the more power other people seemed to gain over the terms of her survival. In youth, it had been husbands and titled men. In old age, it became lawyers, attendants, managers, and the small circle controlling access to her person and her money. At some point, Barbara granted power of attorney to her lawyer, Graham Madison. On paper, such a document can be practical. A person in failing health may need help managing property, accounts, legal matters, and daily decisions. But in Barbara's story, legal control was never only paperwork. It carried a deeper fear. She had spent her life trying to buy safety, and now safety itself had to be handed to someone else to manage. Later accounts accused Madison of mismanaging what remained of her fortune while improving his own position. The record around these accusations should be handled carefully, but the pattern fits the larger wound of Barbara's life. Once again, a person placed near her wealth was accused of benefiting from the access. Once again, Barbara's fortune did not create protection. It created opportunity for someone standing close enough to use it. Properties were sold. Objects disappeared from the life that had once been built around collecting, gifting, and display. The great houses, jewels, and furnishings that had made the public envy her began to scatter. To outsiders, this could be read as another chapter in reckless spending. But that version is too simple. By then, Barbara was no longer the young heiress throwing money across society. She was a sick and isolated woman whose affairs were being handled through other people. That distinction matters. A vulnerable fortune can vanish in many ways. Some of it goes through taxes, some through settlements, some through maintenance, some through generosity, some through waste, some, according to later accounts, through poor management or outright self-interest by those trusted to protect it. Barbara's tragedy is not that every dollar disappeared in one dramatic act. It is that the wealth everyone thought made her powerful still failed to give her secure control over her own life. The story of the gifts shows how cold that loss of control could become. Later reports describe efforts to reclaim expensive items Barbara had given away, including jewels and gifts to people who had once been close to her. Whatever the legal reasoning, the emotional picture is hard to ignore. A woman who had used gifts for years as one of her ways to create connection was now being represented by demands that pulled those gifts back. Even her generosity could be turned into an accounting problem. That is a harsh final turn for a life built around money. Barbara had often tried to use wealth to keep people near. Sometimes that made her vulnerable. Sometimes it made her look careless. But in the end, even the gestures she had made toward affection could be sorted, priced, challenged, and dragged back into the ledger. The woman disappeared again behind the value of the objects. By this stage, the old Woolworth empire that had once seemed impossible to exhaust had been severely reduced. The public had spent decades imagining her money as limitless. But no fortune remains untouched when it becomes the center of lawsuits, marriages, taxes, gifts, management, real estate, illness, and social display. Barbara's inheritance had been treated like a resource by too many people for too long. Eventually, even that resource could be emptied. The humiliation was not only financial, it was human. To be born into a fortune is to be told, again and again, that you have control. But Barbara Hutton's life showed the opposite. Control was often held by the people who advised her, married her, wrote about her, represented her, or waited for her to weaken. She had money, but not always power. She had access, but not always safety. She had a famous name, but not always a voice that people respected. In the final stretch of her life, the myth became almost cruel in its simplicity. The public still knew the phrase, "poor little rich girl." It still knew the 7 marriages, the jewels, the dramatic losses, the vanished fortune. But those facts were arranged in a way that made Barbara look like the author of her own ruin. The people who had used her, judged her, billed her, courted her, mocked her, and profited from her remained less visible. That is why this chapter matters. It shows the final function of her wealth. At first, it made her visible. Then it made her desirable. Then it made her useful. At the end, when her health had declined and her emotional defenses were gone, it made her dependent on people who could still read her life as an account to be managed. Barbara Hutton's fortune had always been described as a gift. In practice, it often behaved like an open door. Husbands entered through it. Newspapers entered through it. Society entered through it. Lawyers and managers entered through it. The woman at the center kept trying to find safety inside the rooms money bought for her. But room after room, the same lesson returned. Wealth could surround her, but it could not guarantee that anyone inside the room would love her without a motive. In 1979, Barbara Hutton died in California at the age of 66. There was no grand final image that could match the myth the newspapers had built around her. No palace, no titled husband, no crowd waiting outside, no triumphant return to society. The woman once introduced to the world through headlines about money left it after years of illness, isolation, and loss. The fortune that had made her famous had been deeply reduced. The people who once circled the heiress had mostly vanished. That ending was not shocking because she had been poor. It was shocking because she had once represented the opposite of poverty. Barbara Hutton had been sold to the public as proof that money could buy every form of safety. Yet by the end, the rooms around her felt less like protection than retreat. The same wealth that had attracted husbands, lawyers, society figures, and reporters could not give her a stable family, a lasting marriage, or the kind of care that asks for nothing in return. The press had always known how to use her. At 18, she was the Depression-era debutante whose party cost enough to outrage a country. As a young wife, she was the heiress with titled husbands. During her divorces, she was the woman who could not keep love. After Lance, she was the tragic mother with no anchor left. At the end, she became the faded rich girl, another headline to close a story. The public thought it already understood. That was the damage of the nickname. Poor little rich girl sounded like pity, but it carried blame. It allowed people to look at Barbara's life and decide the lesson was simple. Money had spoiled her, and sadness was the price of her own excess. That version made the public comfortable. It meant they did not have to think too hard about the men who saw her fortune as a route to power, the newspapers that sold her pain, or the managers and advisors who gained access when she was most dependent. The truth was colder than the nickname. Barbara Hutton's wealth did not make her untouchable. It made her reachable in a dangerous way. It drew people toward her before they knew her. It changed the meaning of courtship, marriage, friendship, advice, and even care. When someone offered love, she had to wonder what else they saw. When someone offered help, she had to wonder what it would cost. When someone stayed close, she had to wonder whether they were staying for Barbara or for the Woolworth money. That question followed her for most of her life. It followed her from the Plaza Hotel to the ballrooms, from European marriages to Hollywood headlines, from custody disputes to lonely hotel rooms. It followed her into every public judgment. People said she had too much, but the deeper problem was that too many people treated what she had as permission to use her. That does not mean Barbara made no mistakes. She did. She spent heavily. She trusted badly. She reached for belonging in ways that often brought her more pain. But a woman's mistakes should not erase the systems around those mistakes. The marriage market was real. The press appetite was real. The social hunger around her fortune was real. The loneliness underneath the public image was real. History often prefers a rich woman to be either glamorous or foolish. Barbara Hutton was harder than that. She was a wounded child inside an adult life of money. She was an heiress who could buy almost anything except a safe, emotional home. She was a mother who loved her son and still passed down some of the distance that had marked her own childhood. She was a public figure, mocked for pain that many people had helped create. By the time the story ended, the world had kept the easiest version. It kept the 7 marriages. It kept the jewels. It kept the spending. It kept the phrase, "poor little rich girl," because that phrase made her simple. What it did not keep with the same care was the pattern of extraction around her. Men wanted access. Newspapers wanted drama. Society wanted spectacle. Advisors wanted control. The woman herself kept looking for safety. That is the real verdict of Barbara Hutton's life. She was not ruined because she had too much money. She was ruined because money made her loneliness profitable. It made her pain entertaining. It made her trust valuable to the wrong people. It made the world believe she had no right to be hurt. The public remembered the rich girl because the rich girl was easy to judge. What history buried was Barbara, the child who lost her mother, the woman who kept reaching for love, the mother who lost her son, and the heiress who discovered that the most expensive rooms in the world could still leave a person completely unsafe. If this story made you see Barbara Hutton differently, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories about women remembered through myth instead of truth, subscribe to Gilded Women.